there's a couple of things that have come out of this. One is, for me, at least, just from the initial thoughts, is the integrated nature of this. Everyone has mentioned electricity, heat, and at least some people have mentioned electric vehicles. So when you start getting into the heat debate, you start getting into actually a much more integrated debate than just talking about electricity. You can go and have a discussion about electricity, and it is mainly just about electricity. If you start a discussion about heat, you don't. And the other thing is data, as the plea from Simon for better data. There's the talk from Chris that we heard about the fact that you need data. There was Saskia's talk, which was about effectively using energy system data to help manage the system itself from heat. So they're the two kind of key themes that I've picked out from it. I've got some questions in my head, but before I start launching off with some questions, I'm going to ask if there's any from the audience. No? Right, well, I'm going to let you think about some questions. I'm going to start with one, and I'm going to also ask if we can get Chris and Saskia to answer to this as well. Everything that we've heard about in this is all quite interesting. And all of it, actually, to me, has an interesting role. But I still get the sense, and I want you all to have a think about this, that there's too much kind of silo advocacy going on in this space compared to electricity. So everyone's like, my thing's the best, and that thing over there in heat is not as good, so you don't want to do that. And then someone else comes up, and so, so Dave, for example, you could be sort of accused of being kind of like, oh, well, I do big heat pumps, so I'm just going to advocate for that. Chris, you could be accused of, well, I work in gas, so I'm going to advocate for gas. And I could do the same with everyone, right? So my question is, are we too siloed? Do you think that's a fair accusation? And how do we get out of it so that actually we start to see heat decarbonisation, the right thing in the right place? Dave, you've got the first microphone, so you go first.
So I've got the microphone, so I'll sing first. I agree with you, Tim, but I think I've got an observation for that. I think when we're talking about decarbonising society, we're making the mistake that thinking there is one society and there is one type of building. And actually, when you step back, and we think of it as 4 different segments. We think of it as old stuff that's large and old stuff that's small. So that could be the centre of London, Westminster Palace, versus my house in the suburb of Glasgow, which is a bungalow. And then there's the new stuff, which is new districts of London, which can be treated one way. And then there's the new stuff, which is a brand new house, which has been topical. I think what you'll tend to find is that there are different techniques, and they tend to be less overlapping when you think about the different things. So we're not likely to decarbonise the Westminster Palace, for example, by putting an air source heat pump on the roof. But that might well be the right way to do properties in the suburbs. Ground source might be the way of doing that. Equally, you're not likely, as I heard somebody suggest at a conference many years ago, drill 2,000 boreholes underneath Westminster Palace to get heat from the ground. So when we stop and think of the segments of what society looks like, we start seeing quite sensible silos, and actually there's no bad thing of having different routes to different things. Buses are different from cars, are different from planes. So that's my comment.
Chris?
Yeah. Obviously, coming from a gas background, I'm completely biased. So, I've worked as a gas engineer for years, and I suppose my perspective of it was, evidence was my thing. That's why we started commissioning lots and lots of research. What that's led to actually is projects. So the Freedom Project was with our local distribution network operator. It was a gas and electricity project. The current project we're doing, which is called Green City Vision, which is Swindon, is working with SSEN and UK Power Networks, again, to look at it, but looking at it from a whole systems perspective. So I think I've changed, Tim, from a few years ago when I couldn't imagine consumers would do anything different, because why would they, to a point where actually moving from the problems to solutions. So that's probably where I am, Tim.
Thank you. Simon?
Well, I just think, given the challenges, we are going to have to remove the silos, and we are going to have to work collaboratively. As I said, to get 17% of the heat demand from heat networks, efficient heat networks, in a decarbonised way, it's a huge opportunity, but business as normal is not going to be the way forward. So we are going to have to break down the silos and to produce the solutions.
Yeah, so very much following on from the sectoral approach. So we approach the market in a similar way. So you've got new buildings, you've got commercial buildings, you've got existing residential on-grid, existing residential off-grid, and there will be different solutions that mix and match between all of them. Essentially, we're a multi-technology approach, so we've got a number of different technologies on the market today, numerous things in development, including hydrogen, for example, which could be an alternative for the 85% of the UK dwellings that are currently on the gas grid. It all boils down to, for us, the end user. So it's consumer comfort, consumer cost. So what are they willing to pay for upgrades and running costs, and what's the best way of actually arriving at that? So I think essentially integration and smart grid interaction will play a big part around actually changing that current mindset, because at the minute it's a very, very black and white. So it's either gas or electricity, and there's, with the exception of hybrids, never the twain shall meet. That's going to change a bit. I think we'll move towards more of an integration between the two and a playoff between how to get the best end result, really.
Well, I think we're pretty clear that the long-term outlook is for varied energy solutions, and as the previous panelists have said, all buildings are different, and we're going to need different solutions for different buildings and different load types. But I think what we've got to be very careful about is standing at the bus stop and waiting for the next bus to come along. So we shouldn't be stopping development of all these new potential technologies, biofuels, hydrogen, greater integration of networks, all those things. But we've got to start progressing now with technologies that are available now. And we've done very little in the UK with heat pumps, and primarily that's because gas is cheap. So actually what we need is leadership from government on energy policy, and I think that I would say we've had a lack of leadership for years in energy policy in the UK, and until we start seeing that, I suspect not a lot's going to happen, and Greta Thunberg will be very, very cross with us all, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think most people have already covered that if you end up in your silo, you're not going to be able to address every segment of the market. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but I think it's also important to think about that diversity in solutions helps you progress more quickly, because if you can move one small segment, that you can learn something about moving the other segment. So I think if everyone is applied through the same solution, it's fairly obvious that you're going to get stuck for a bit, and it's going to be harder to make changes. You're going to have to make huge step changes, where if you have a lot of diversity in your solutions, it's much easier to make small changes and kind of cascade them through and be more agile about how you're going to fix the problems that come up, because new problems are always going to come up.
Sorry, thank you very much. Well, we have some questions. Excellent. Right, have we got some questions from people that haven't asked questions before? Not that I'm sure that they're great questions, it's just nice to have a bit of... We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Roxanne from Delta Energy and Environment, and I wanted to get the opinion of the other panelists on what Chris Clark was saying about heat as a service, whether this is something that they agree is the future and it's happening now, or if they think it's something that still needs to be resolved, as one of the other members of the audience asked.
Thanks very much. So, Bean, heat as a service.
Absolutely. I think we are going to see heat as a service, but not everywhere, because it won't suit everybody. And we've got to bear in mind that I think it's quite difficult to make heat as a service work in an environment that's anything other than monopoly. It's very difficult to, we can integrate electricity suppliers into the same cable that goes into a house, and you can get onto U-switch and change your supplier. Other switches are available. But with heat, it's a bit more difficult, because the scale of infrastructure that you might require to feed lots of different heat sources into a given network, more tricky. And so we do run the risk of a greater number of monopolies on heat. That may not serve the consumer well. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out yet. It'll be very interesting to see how people like the Heat Trust manage those sorts of situations.
I think absolutely, in several different sectors. I think in the domestic sector, there's absolutely no way, and I've still got a gas boiler in my house, and I'm a heat pump guy. There's absolutely no way I'm going to spend £16,000 to £20,000 in a market that is completely immature at the moment to do something when really what I would love to do is say to my utility provider, I will sign up for a 10-year personal heat purchase contract for my house, which will increase the value of my house, but they promise to make it cheaper than gas. So that's the first comment. On a larger comment, if we're going to harvest heat from the Thames for London, and incidentally there's 1.3 gigawatts of heat capacity available from the Thames. If you take the flow rate, 70 cubic meters per second, and multiply with the specific heat of water and cooling by 3 degrees, which is allowable by the Environmental Protection Agency, you could harvest 1.3 gigawatts of heat. Now, we're not going to send heat up Fleet Street or whichever street you want to pick, and everybody is owning their own part of that network. It's going to be shared. Nobody owns a power station other than the power station companies, so think of it in that way. So in that case, we will be selling heat to the individual buildings. So both domestically and on a city scale basis, it has to be via that. So the question then turns, what is going to make the money guys want to put their money into that? And I think that's the really important bit. And at the moment, it kind of touches what Bean says, we're not yet seeing a commercial model that people would invest in because they're not yet seeing enough people joining the network. You build a network, nobody joins it, you lose your money. So how do you make people join networks? That's the key question in all of this.
Jeff?
Yeah, so it's something we've looked at very closely at a group level. Again, different horses for different courses, essentially. So where you've got a fixed ownership of the building, heat as a service, over a period of time, heat as a service makes a lot of sense. So, for example, social housing, for example, is something we've looked at quite closely with this. When you've got private homeowners that move home on average between every 7 and 10 years, can you have the length of contract needed in order to sort of capitalise and make back the initial investment in the plant? Ian Manders was here before, he's disappeared off now, but there was an interesting point raised by Ian which sort of links back to the Green Deal. So when people talk to us about heat as a service, they say, okay, you pay for your mobile phone monthly, you pay for your car monthly, for example. Those are assets that can be removed in the event of a default on payment. If we're going to invest, 8, 10, 12,000 pounds in, for example, a fuel cell or a heat pump or whatever type of technology, you need to have a significant sort of pathway of time to enable to sort of recoup the capital investment on that and then start to move in towards a profit. So first you've got a big chunk of upfront capital at risk, and then you've got how tenable is that over time, which is one of the questions we need to see answered. So baby steps, we're keeping an eye on the market, and then when things start to resolve and that business model becomes more transparent, then we'll start to have a look at it a bit more seriously.
Simon?
Yes, I think in principle, yes, and I was interested to hear about the Canadian experience. I think it fundamentally comes down to customer service and a quantum shift in the historic way in which energy suppliers look after their customers, and I think it requires an evolution of that. Yeah. So yes, in principle, and be interested to see other international experience.
So thank you for all those thoughts. There's universal support for this. Interestingly, first thing I'm going to do a cheeky plug, which is that I did a talk on this. I actually did it back at our conference. It's on YouTube. If you want to go and have a look at the ADE website, or it's on the ADE stand, you can go and have a look at me waffling on about whether heat as a service will work. The biggest challenge, interesting, that it didn't get mentioned, the biggest challenge for me is trust. Am I really going to trust? Like, there's a whole question about energy company trust right now, and I don't know if you saw what the Committee on Climate Change came out with last week or 2 weeks ago, the work that they did on housing, existing housing. And they said the biggest problem with the houses that we are building now, and I know there's lots of builders in here, is that they don't meet the current standards. Not that they don't meet future standards, they're just not built well enough now to meet the standards. They're not acceptable. Now, if you take those two things, energy companies having fairly low levels of trust and the built environment not building to the current legal minimum, there's quite a trust problem. So I think interesting, I remain persuaded it's the only way you can decarbonize heat, but there's quite a lot of problems that the industry's going to have to deal with. So we're going to come back to these two. We've got 3 questions, and we'll take all 3 of them, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond, and then I think that will probably take us to time's up.
Interesting that water can be a lot cheaper for energy storage than batteries. I notice in Denmark and Holland, they're building very big interseasonal heat reservoirs. Do you see that kind of thing developing here?
Okay, we've got one question here just in front of you, and then a question over here. Sorry? Okay, one question over here. So, interseasonal stores.
Yes, thank you. It's Edward Thompson from ISACS Limited. There's a suggestion that a lot of it comes back to the consumer and what the consumer wants, and there's various different silos, and we should be looking at the consumer. But in fact, an investment in renewable energy is a private investment for a public benefit. It's society as a whole which needs decarbonisation. And if we're focusing on decarbonisation, we have to stop burning things, because combustion produces CO2.
So what's the question?
Yeah, the question is, we need to focus, and the government, and I think the government needs to focus on the answer to decarbonisation, because things like hydrogen is just passing the buck.
Can we get a question?
The question is, when are we going to move to get the government to answer things like the Paris, it signs up to the Paris Agreement, but no one is actually addressing the real question of decarbonisation, which is to stop burning things. So are we going to move in that direction?
Rhetoric disconnected from reality is your challenge. And we did have this one question here. You ready to take it? We take the... And we got like a... Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you. My question ties in quite nicely, actually, with the ICAG's comment, which is about hydrogen or H2. 3 parts. I'd like to hear the panel's view about the cost, the efficiency of the system, and the final one, the source of the hydrogen.
Okay, cool. That's nice and tight. And I think I'll also come to Chris on that. So we will start with Jeff. So you've got 3 questions. You've got interseasonal storage, you've got rhetoric versus reality, and you've got hydrogen. And you don't have to answer all 3.
Okay, so storage then first off. So yes, interseasonal storage needs a vast volume of water, as you can imagine. I actually saw an interesting piece of research. I can't remember the university or institution, so they'll probably shoot me, but it was to do with the potential for perhaps using old coal mines as an interseasonal store, so flooding back old coal mines, because you've got that gradation of heat as you get deeper down into the earth, and actually using that and then pumping it back. And there's a similar scheme that's in operation in one of the Scandi countries, which has a similar sort of deep storage metric. Interesting concepts. It's more of an infrastructure thing than the sort of thing we get involved in, but there is the potential to then boost further any potential interseasonal storage from a large-scale source with a water source heat pump. So it does have some sort of follow-on application that we could get involved in. So an interesting concept, certainly. Hydrogen then, and this whole sort of thing about rhetoric of burning versus not burning. Essentially, sort of comfort is, it's on Maslow's hierarchy. Heating comfort is something everyone needs. If we don't heat buildings and properties in the right way, people are going to die. So there's an absolute imperative to get it right. So understand there's a need for leadership. There is a need for some more sort of strong policy in this area, but it needs to be also cost effective. You've got the fuel poverty angle to talk about as well. And at the moment, you've got this real disparity between policy cost on the electricity bill, leading to around 17 pence a kilowatt hour, versus gas at 4.1, 4.2 pence a kilowatt hour. So until that diametric thing is resolved, then the running cost argument and the fuel poverty angle will sort of be a stymie towards electrification in our view. Last but not least, hydrogen, very, very quickly. I mean, we're deeply involved in hydrogen. So be it via combustion, so hydrogen combustion, or via catalysation through a fuel cell, we have technology development will do both. Upstream, there are a lot of questions. So as you say, where does it come from? In the longer scheme, longer sort of time frame, then electrification or electrolysis of water is probably the more sustainable way of gaining hydrogen, because you effectively sort of crack H2O, release oxygen, you've got hydrogen to play with. Relatively expensive today to do that. So the initial projects that we've sort of started to see come into the fore, like LEED, for example, are based on the principle of CCS and SMR, so steam methane reformation of natural gas and carbon capture and storage. Now that in itself, I've heard numbers around about 80% efficiency from gas into hydrogen out. So from an energy cost and efficiency point of view, there's burn the gas is the easiest way of doing it, but obviously you've got a climate change target to meet. So it depends on whether the goal is efficiency and cost or emissions, because burning hydrogen at point of use, the emission is water, which we can deal with quite happily.
All right, I'm Chris. I'm going to come to Chris, because you're obviously there's a hydrogen angle at WWU.
Yeah, the hydrogen question. So the cost is estimated to be around 8 pence kilowatt hour. That's using SMRs with carbon capture and storage. Yeah, okay, retrofit cost per house. Tests done to date indicate that your pipework in your house is okay, albeit it may well be changed. The gas boiler would require a new gas boiler at the cost of a gas boiler. So those are being developed now. So effectively, the H21 study that was done by Northern Gas Networks effectively said if you did it as a sort of, call it a monopoly company that could effectively invest over 45 years and get its payback in the same way as we do transportation costs now, then the cost would be certainly equivalent to or less than full electrification. I think we've got to look at each one of these is not just what the cost is, or I'd rather call it investment, because we're investing in a better future. It's, well, how does that investment compare with all the other different investments? But I don't think it's a binary thing. I really hate the idea of it's hydrogen, it's electrification. It's all of the above. The scale of the challenge is so massive that we need every single one of these technologies. Just let's make them work together.
The word hydrification is going to happen, isn't it? It's going to be awful. Dave?
Very briefly, large storage, yes, if we've got large networks, but I don't think we've got that. So why would you build storage for something that doesn't exist is the obvious thing. In terms of the hydrogen aspect, I generally do think it's the most pervasive and dangerous thing that's being talked about in our society at the moment, because it will lull massive parts of government to sit and do nothing. And that is a major problem because they're not doing enough. From a very specific technical perspective, I commend Chris for being honest about it. It will be much, much more expensive. From a citizen of Europe, as much as we still are, the European Union imports 400 billion euros a year of fossil fuel. We need to reduce that amount because that is effectively 400 billion euros leaving our economic community en masse. And yes, I have heard of Brexit, but we'll see what happens. So I think the Germans do a lot of things very, very well, and one thing that they're doing very well in their energy setup is following a principle of net zero OPEX. They don't mind how much the capital cost is, so long as when you actually run it, it's very cheap to run. So the wind blows for free, the sun shines for free, harvest a fuel source that longer term, 20, 30, 40 years is free, and it's worth putting the money into it. That's not what hydrogen is. It's an increase in the amount of use of methane for SMR, which is still not at scale. CCS is absolutely required for that. It's still not at scale. So we can sit waiting for this unicorn to come trouncing over the hill, and it won't arrive. And in 40 years' time, Greta Thunberg will be 56 and saying, my goodness, what a bunch of arseholes they all were.
Thank you. Bean?
Yeah. She'll be saying, I told you so, and she'll be dead right, because the house probably is on fire. I think the problem, and Dave's absolutely right, and my fear here is that we have the concepts of large-scale biofuels, we have the concepts of large-scale hydrogen, and at the moment they are just not commercialized, and nobody, as far as I can tell us when they will be commercialized. Interesting that you've put a price on hydrogen, because that's the first time I've heard that price, and no one can actually tell us what the true carbon content of these fuels is going to be when we get them. So I don't think we should stop trying to develop them, but we've got to get on now with what we've got now. And actually what we have now is exactly the sort of kit that we've been talking about here. We've got to get on and start using heat pumps and use them, yes, with the smart sitting on top to allow us not to stress the electricity grid. There's a lot of conversations going on with the national grid about how we might do this. They are actively talking about, several millions of heat pumps by 2030. And what I think is really interesting is everyone talks about the stress on the grid. The Energy Networks Association, with the DNOs, is currently working on a scheme to deliver what we call connect and notify. At the moment, if you want to put a heat pump into your house, technically speaking, you need consent from your DNO, prior consent. They are putting together a scheme to deliver connect and notify for devices up to 32 amps. That would cover probably about 90% of UK domestic properties. I do not think they would be offering that if they felt that the rate of deployment that we're going to see as a result will stress their networks. They just wouldn't do it. So I think they've actually already bitten that bullet, and they've probably done so because they're also staring at electric vehicles. And actually we can manage heat pumps in the same way that we manage electric vehicle charging. We can do a lot of off-peak charging of thermal stores, a lot of off-peak charging of vehicle batteries, and actually we can manage a lot of the new demand that we're seeing in that way. It's not going to be easy, okay? It isn't going to be easy. None of this is going to be easy. If it was easy, we'd be doing it already. If it was easy and cheap, we'd already be doing it. We're not. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be expensive. And I think that's where the leadership comes from. And I know that I can't think of any politicians who are going to say we're going to put up the price of gas, because they can only see 5 years down the track. Right. But fundamentally, we have burnt cheap gas for far too long.
I'm going to move to Simon. Pass to Simon for the final word.
Well, I'm afraid I'm not able to comment on the technical aspects, but picking up on your wider point about the political, what I would call abdication, I mean, just my personal view, I won't mention the B word, but it just seems to me that government policy in this sector is suffering paralysis. And given the climate emergency we are facing, it is an abdication of political will, I'm afraid. So I would agree with you. We have suffered for years on political rhetoric, and surely there is a time now when we have to convert rhetoric into action.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much. I'm going to. I think we've had an interesting discussion. What we definitely haven't got is unilateral agreement. It's quite nice when you have a bit of a panel, a bit of a discussion. One thing that I just want to bring out that we've heard a lot of, there's a lot of government needs to do. Yeah, this is quite a common thing in energy. The other thing that a former colleague of mine always used to say is, the government, we want stability, we want certainty, and here's the list of things we want you to change. So we are a little bit schizophrenic when it comes to dealing with government. I think that the challenge about government is absolutely right. The rhetoric has changed. Since David Cameron left, it's changed 180 degrees. The thing that I would say is that there's no question. There's been no significant policy, real significant policy development since the coalition government in energy at all. That said, there's been things done by Ofgem and National Grid, but not from BEIS. But that said, most people here in industry, and it's very, very easy for us to all abdicate our responsibility. This is our future. This is our life. These are our children that we've got to act on. And so the thing that I'd say is, I work in a trade association. Use your trade association to push government. Make commitments. What are you going to do as an industry? How much are you going to cut carbon by? What promises can you make back to government? Because it's very easy for us to go, oh, it's just dreadful. We need to do more. Government, goodness me. But actually, when they do that, we'll all start lobbying to just make it work for different bits, yeah? So what is it that we can do? So I think there's a bit of a challenge that we need to take away, which is, what is it that we're going to do? How are we going to make change happen? Because it's very, very easy for us to just abdicate responsibility to government. Look, I would like to thank all of our 4 panelists and our 2 keynote speakers as well. Thank you very much. Can you thank them in the normal way? Thank you.